Hello, and welcome to Understanding the Basics, Sexual Violence. The objectives of this training are to increase your knowledge of definitions, both legal and otherwise, of sexual assault, provide you with data on its prevalence, and to examine barriers to reporting, with particular attention being paid to the increased hurdles faced by victims and survivors from historically underserved and marginalized communities. I want to start this presentation by making sure we all share an understanding of what constitutes sexual violence. As you will see from this list, the scope of behaviors identified by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention as falling under this definition are broader than traditional conceptions of rape, and the definition we will use is theirs. Sexual violence is a sexual act committed against someone without that person's freely given consent. Why is a consistent definition important? It helps us to monitor the prevalence of sexual violence and examine trends over time, assists in determining the magnitude of sexual violence, and aids in comparing the problem across jurisdictions. Consistency allows researchers to measure risk and protective factors for victimization and perpetration in a uniform manner. This ultimately informs prevention and intervention efforts. Some terms that are more familiar to most of us than the technical definitions on the last slide include, but are not limited to, these. In recent months, sexual harassment has received enormous attention due to the Me Too hashtag. Even with this outpouring of public awareness and the accompanying willingness of people, mostly women, to speak out about their experiences of harassment and the assaults that are often part of that pattern of harassment, it's important to recognize that many, many more are still carrying their victimization silently. We also have to recognize who the perpetrators are. So often when we see sexual assaults represented in movies or on TV, the assailant is a stranger, the victim a beautiful young woman, the place where it takes place a dark alley. None of this is really true. Another aspect of the Me Too movement has been the drawing back of a curtain on the fact that most perpetrators are known to the victim. They're a boss, a colleague, a family member, an acquaintance or a friend, an intimate partner. During 1 week in 2016, Skadvasa member organizations served around 900 survivors. Of these, 93% of survivors who identified the perpetrator knew the person who assaulted them. Let's turn now to look at the laws addressing sexual assault in South Carolina. Although there are many challenges for survivors seeking justice through our criminal legal system, laws are important. They state expectations of behavior and delineate what society believes to be unacceptable behavior, and further lay out the consequences for violating those norms. Our laws are all based on a definition of sexual battery with aggravating circumstances increasing the level of the charge and the possible penalties. The degrees of seriousness are in reverse order, with third degree being the lowest level charge, to the first degree being the highest or worst. Our definition of sexual battery is sexual intercourse, cunnilingus, fellatio, anal intercourse, or any intrusion, however slight, of any part of a person's body or of any object into the genital or anal openings of another person's body, except when such intrusion is accomplished for medically recognized treatment or diagnostic purposes. Criminal sexual conduct, first degree, is a felony for which the offender can face up to 30 years imprisonment. It is sexual battery plus any one or more of the following: aggravated force, which means that the actor uses physical force or physical violence of a high and aggravated nature to overcome the victim, or includes the threat of the use of a deadly weapon. Forcible confinement, kidnapping, trafficking, robbery, extortion, burglary, housekeeping, or similar. Or the administration without consent of a controlled substance or any intoxicating substance which causes mental incapacitation or physical helplessness. Criminal sexual conduct in the second degree is a felony for which offenders can face up to 20 years. It is the underlying definition of sexual battery plus aggravated coercion. This means that the actor threatens to use force or violence of a high and aggravated nature to overcome the victim or another person, if the victim reasonably believes that the actor has the present ability to carry out the threat, or threatens to retaliate in the future by the infliction of physical harm, kidnapping, or extortion under circumstances of aggravation against the victim or any other person. Criminal sexual conduct in the third degree is also a felony with a maximum of 10 years imprisonment. it is the underlying definition of sexual battery plus one or more of the following is proven: force or coercion in the absence of aggravating circumstances, or the offender knows or has reason to know that the victim is mentally defective, mentally incapacitated, or physically helpless, and aggravated force or coercion was not used. It is very important to note that assault with intent to commit sexual battery is subject to the same penalties as the completed act. When the victim is a minor, the charge depends on the victim's age at the time the offense was committed and any previous convictions for a similar offense that the defendant has. Criminal sexual conduct, or CSC, with a minor in the first degree is sexual battery plus the victim is less than 11 years of age or is less than 16 if the offender has a previous conviction included in the list of offenses requiring registration as a sex offender. CSC with a minor in the second degree is sexual battery when the victim is 14 years old or less, but more than 11 years old. And CSC with a minor in the third degree is a lewd or lascivious act if the victim is under 16 years of old and the offender is over 14 years of age. Although the age of consent in South Carolina is 16, there is an exception, commonly known as the Romeo Clause, that means nobody can be convicted of CSC with a minor in the second or third degree if they are 18 years or less when engaging in consensual sexual conduct with another person who is at least 14 years of age. In effect, this exception protects high school students who may be having consensual sexual relationship that their parents do not approve of. In the past, statutory rape laws had sometimes been used to prosecute young men in these circumstances, and there are several examples in which racial biases were the impetus behind these cases being brought. Drug-facilitated sexual assault occurs when alcohol or drugs are used to compromise an individual's ability to consent to sexual activity. Although attention is often most paid to so-called date rape drugs like Rohypnol and the others listed on this slide, it is important to remember that alcohol is the most commonly used drug in crimes of sexual assault. It is legal, and our communities are awash with it. Cultures of heavy drinking are common on college campuses and other places to which young people are drawn, and significantly increase their vulnerability, while also decreasing their ability to resist an assault or an unwanted sexual advance. If a victim was drinking, they may also be less likely to report their assault, fearing that they will be shamed or not believed. We have heard from our member organizations that in some jurisdictions, law enforcement will not investigate sexual assaults in which the victim was intoxicated. We'll now focus on the prevalence of sexual violence. The National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey conducted by the CDC recorded that nearly 1 in 5 women and 1 in 71 men reported having been raped at least once during their life. As noted earlier, stranger danger is not the driving force behind these extremely high levels of victimization. 51%, over half of female victims of rape, report that an intimate partner was their rapist. 41% that it was an acquaintance. As you probably expect, almost 80% of victims first experienced sexual assault when they were young, before the age of 25. In 2016, in our one-week service census, services were provided to nearly 900 primary and secondary survivors, and responses were made to 141 crisis hotline calls. Every statistic is a lens through which we gain an understanding of the subject. The pictures they individually show are often very different, so it's important that we take everything into account. For example, you will see here that in 2015, the last year for which data is currently available, 2,470 incidents were reported to SLED. By contrast, 5,698 new clients were seen by the 15 rape crisis centers in our state during the financial year 2016 to 2017. Although I'm using different years in this comparison, the numbers generally remain fairly stable from year to year. But even this higher number only gives us a partial view of the problem, as many victims and survivors do not come forward at all and do not seek services. In addition to the crisis line and hospital accompaniments, our member organizations provide holistic services that may include counseling, group counseling, legal and medical advocacy, yoga, and other activity-based groups that can provide a path to healing that the criminal justice system may not be able to do. They also provide primary prevention education in their communities. In 1 week, during 2016, our 15-member rape crisis centers provided over 40 prevention and education opportunities, reaching 1,260 people. This difference in lenses becomes more visible when we contrast requests for services from a rape crisis center with the attrition of cases through the criminal legal system. In these data, you can see that 1,197 clients were provided with services at one of our member organizations serving 5 counties. This contrasts with 402 incidents reported to law enforcement within those counties, which resulted in only 49 arrests. We do not have data on convictions, as many of these cases are either dismissed or pled down, but convictions for sexual assault are extremely rare. Why don't people report? There are many barriers to reporting sexual assault, and while some survivors find a sense of validation in pursuing action through the criminal legal system, for others this process is unsatisfying, re-traumatizing, and can seem pointless. This slide does not provide an exhaustive list, but here are some common barriers to reporting. First, there is a persistent idea that women fabricate stories of rape to ruin men's lives, otherwise referred to as the rape myth. There has never been any evidence that indicates that the rate of false report is higher in rape cases than for any other crime, but unfortunately crimes in which women are the primary victims and men the primary offenders, such as sexual and domestic violence, are often subject to the perpetuation of this myth. We've recently seen several high-profile cases where women who have come forward have been accused of lying, even when there is evidence supporting their accusations. 2. Victims may be sometimes unaware of what constitutes an assault. This may be particularly true for older and younger survivors of sexual violence. 3. Victims may blame themselves for the assault or believe they contributed to it because they were drinking or flirting or had previously had sex with the offender. Unfortunately, these narratives of self-blame are often reinforced by the systems and professionals charged with providing assistance, or by friends, families, or communities. We have heard, for instance, from our member organizations that law enforcement will often not investigate rape cases where the victim had been drinking. Unfortunately, even if they do, a jury may see her drinking as a contributing factor. Unfortunately, drinking or other drug use by victims is seen as increasing their responsibility for being raped, while drinking or drug use by offenders is seen as an excuse for their behavior. 4. Victims may fear retaliation against them or their families if they report, especially if the offender has power or standing within their community. There are also increased barriers for survivors from marginalized communities. In 1855, a 19-year-old enslaved black woman named Celia killed the white man who owned her and was trying to rape her. Missouri law allowed a woman to use force when in imminent danger of forced sexual intercourse, but the judge ruled an enslaved woman had no right to refuse her master. Celia was convicted of murder, sentenced to death, and hanged on December 21, 1855. This story may be from 1855, but it is critical that we understand how different identities and their interactions with systems still shape one's ability to report sexual violence in our contemporary culture. Intersectionality is made up of 3 basic building blocks: social identities, systems of oppression, and then ways in which they intersect. Individuals' experiences are shaped by the ways in which their social identities intersect with each other and with interacting systems of oppression. For instance, a person can be all black, a woman, and elderly. This means she may face racism, sexism, and ageism as she navigates everyday life, including experiences of violence. If you look at the different pictures in this slide, you will see multiple possible combinations of identity that may increase barriers for people accessing services. African American survivors and communities. The quotes on this slide are from one of the women raped by former Oklahoma City police officer Daniel Holtzclaw. He consistently preyed on African American women who were from higher crime communities or had existing legal problems, as he did not think that the women would report, and that if they did, they would not be believed. His defense at trial, at which 13 women testified, was a recitation of the themes that we talked about earlier for why victims don't report. They are liars, they have agendas, they are drug users, and sex workers. It is also important to recognize that African American women have a higher level of self-reported victimization than the population average. Some additional barriers for African American survivors are listed here. As you can see, they are deeply rooted in the history of slavery and continued racial oppression in our society. Biased and negative cultural beliefs, distrust of systems that have historically oppressed communities, and a code of racial loyalty that seeks to keep troubles within the community and avoid bringing negative attention from the dominant culture. LGBTQ+ survivors and communities. When working with members of the LGBTQ+ community, it is important to remember the spectrum of sexual orientation and gender identification that it contains. Risks faced by gay men, bisexuals, or trans women will vary greatly, but the risk of sexual assault tends to be higher across the community. Additional barriers that survivors from this community face include discrimination, and that can include a lack of family support as well as community support. Confidentiality, people do not want to be outed to the wider community. Restricted options for safety and services, and fear and distrust of systems. Although disability is one word, its definitions include a wide range of limitations, including sensory, cognitive, ambulatory, self-care, and independent living. The rate of serious violent crime for persons with disabilities is more than 3 times the rate for persons without disabilities, and that rate is even higher for individuals who live with multiple disabilities. Additional barriers in accessing services, criminal legal system, prevention education, communicating consent exist for survivors. And it is also important to remember that caregivers may be the offender, leading to very difficult decisions for a survivor to make in reporting the offense. Recently, NPR ran a series that highlighted sexual abuse with individuals with intellectual disabilities, and I would recommend that everybody listen and access this series. Survivors with limited English skills, especially if they are undocumented immigrants, face additional barriers in a reasonable fear of authorities and deportation, fears that have grown exponentially during the past few months, cultural beliefs that may impact views on victimhood and offenders, a lack of bilingual direct service staff and or culturally responsive interpretation services, and a lack of outreach into LEP communities about services available. At Skadvasa, we have a project that seeks to address the last of these two. As our society ages, it is important that we recognize the special needs of older survivors. During the last year for which we have data available, only 57 victims aged 65 or above received services at our membership rape crisis centers. When you compare that with the total number of new victims, which was over 5,000, you see that there is a terrific gap here. Older survivors may not be believed because society believes sexual assault only happens to younger people. They may not be believed if they have any cognitive limitations. Or if they were born before the violence against women's movement, they may not have the language to identify the assault. They may also hold generational beliefs that increase their feelings of shame and guilt. Assaults against older adults take place in private dwellings and institutional settings, and it is important to remember that caregivers or family members can be the offender. Older adults are also less likely to have a strong support system. An assault may exacerbate an existing illness, and the chances are that their recovery time will be longer and they will have an increased chance of infection. This brief overview of our diverse communities shows the importance of victim-centered advocacy. We don't view the world as it is. We view it as our culture and experiences have taught us to view it. We all make meaning of our lives through these lenses. The 5 pointers on this slide are a good foundation in which to root our advocacy and response to survivors of sexual violence. Always prioritize victim safety and the victim's ability to make decisions on how to proceed with their healing or interaction with our or other systems. Work to build their resiliency. Remember that although we feel we're constantly fighting battles with systems, to others, particularly survivors, we appear to have and do have power. Always approach your work from a trauma-informed perspective and maintain confidentiality of victim information. And finally, it is important that we build collaborations within our communities so we know who to call when it becomes necessary. We must always recognize that victims are the experts in their own lives. We must listen to what they tell us and what they need. We should never assume that we know best. Our job is to work with them, not to lift them out of danger. This presentation provides a very basic introduction to information about sexual violence and the response to survivors. Please contact us for more advanced training on specialized topics within this area. Thank you.